So what is ubiquitous assimilation?
Always absorbing everything everywhere all the time.
Well done, George. How are you to imagine anything if the images are always provided for you? Who here read 1984 last year? To deliberately believe in lies while knowing they're false. This is a marketing holocaust. 24 hours a day. For the rest of our lives, the powers that be are hard at work, dumbing us to death. So, to defend ourselves and fight against assimilating this dullness into our thought processes, we must learn to read, to stimulate our own imaginations, to cultivate our own consciousness, our own belief systems. We all need these skills to defend, to preserve our own minds.
Hello there. This is Hypnagogic Radio, an initiation by conversation into the dark corners of myth, magic, and meaning. A crash course in cult culture and conspiracy. A virtuous virus invoking and informing history, holiness, and heresy. Each week, I, your host Miguel Connor, commandeers your connection to bring the most accepted and rejected scholars and provocateurs to your attention. Fun, compelling, and deeply weird, this is the blow-your-mind cocktail party conversation you always wanted to listen in on. But we're often too afraid to do so because Daddy Jehovah and Mommy Gaia said you should stay in your room of complacency, normality, and bigotry. You should be mentally sodomized and not spiritually heard. But no more, for you are the eternal soundtrack of the counterculture. Modern-day Tom Sawyers, champion eternals for all eternity. Oh, you who are both jokers and thieves. There must be some way out of here.
My father says that almost the whole world is asleep. Everybody you know, everybody you see, everybody you talk to. He says that only a few people are awake, and they live in a state of constant, total amazement.
As sculptor Eric Gill said, the artist is not a different kind of person, but every person is a different kind of artist. You come to the virtual Alexandria to find you are an artist brimming with power and can create better than the creator gods and their butt slaves in the establishment. You'll find your authentic voice and silence the terrible sirens of this cosmos Chris Knowles writes so much about in The Secret Sun. But it's not easy, the path of the true seeker warrior, especially when the archons notice you're a threat. As the old saying goes, whom the gods love they kill. Whom the gods hate, first they make mad, then they kill. It's like Winston in 1984. It wasn't enough to get a bullet on the back of his head. He had to witness the twisted logic of Archonic Big Brother in all its satanic splendor that made 2 + 2 5.
God isn't for you, Lenny. God is for men who have no use for freedom.
Sometimes just being awake is lonely and painful and bittersweet. Like Oscar Wilde said, a dreamer is one who can only find his way by moonlight, and his punishment is that he sees the dawn before the rest of the world. And as Edmund Lupiere said, ears to hear and eyes to see, that is the tragic ability of the Gnostic.
Solitude is the only peace.
On this April, the year of our Demiurge 2018, we continue with a reoccurring theme of being a valid artist by harnessing the power of imagination and hermetic thinking. shifting those images around us like the Gospel of Philip states to enter the truth, and reinventing ourselves like all children can, as the Gospel of Thomas suggests in many of its sayings. All history is fiction, Alan Moore allegedly said. Souls are made of stories and not atoms, Doctor Who said. And reality is anything you can get away with, Robert Anton Wilson declared.
You're going to have to learn how you can go through a looking glass into another kind of perception where you have that sense of being united to all things, and suddenly you understand everything.
Imagination is more essential than ever in these darksome times. How do we leverage it? For that, we have, as always, the privilege and delight of having back Gary Lachman, who materializes at the virtual Alexandria to discuss his latest work, The Lost Knowledge of the Imagination. As always, Gary's gnosis is game-changing and galvanizing. The book is short and sweet and vastly useful, drawing from the Sophia of the ancient Gnostics and Neoplatonists, the Romantic poets, postmodern philosophers and Enlightenment occultists, and so much more.
Careful, Chief. You dig up the past, all you get is dirty.
And please remember this quote by Colin Wilson. Imagination should be used not to escape reality, but to create it. Or as Carl Jung said, without this playing with fantasy, no creative work has ever yet come to birth. The debt we owe to the play of the imagination is incalculable. You can rise with imagination and being so authentic, as Gary will explain. And as Seth Godin said, the realest thing in our lives are the stories we invent. We live with these stories. We remind ourselves of them. We perfect them. And, happily, if you don't like the story you're telling yourself, you can change it. So get ready to tap into your divine imagination that is part of your inheritance before you are cast in a monkey suit.
Don't you see? It's not about you. It's about them.
But I can't go back.
Don't know that you got a choice, son. No man can walk out on his own story.
Both members and non-members will get the full interview, as we really couldn't do a full second hour due to scheduling issues. Mine having to do with the Gnostic America conference at the time. So as a bonus for members and patrons, I thought I'd add an interview we conducted a couple of years ago that deals with imagination and many of the thinkers and philosophies Gary mentions. Many of you probably didn't hear it, as it was during a time of testing having to do with my daughter Ellie's condition and some other personal issues. So I wasn't able to fully market it or spread it across the internets. It makes infernal sense to give this content some deserved attention, as the Astral guest, along with Gary, is one of my favorite guests and a true influencer of the esoterica. That is Eric G. Wilson, who discussed his book, Keep It Fake, Inventing an Authentic Life. Beyond a best-selling author, Eric is also professor of English at Wake Forest University. Again, you'll find how this interview complements Gary's to fully arm you with the liberating Ubik spray that is imagination. And then you'll write your own gospel and live your own myth, becoming a Promethean artist with a unique voice you were always meant to have. The empire never ended. Welcome to the desert of the real.
Human action resounds in the heavens.
The bell echoes above. What we decide here today will polish or crack the firmament. What shall it be?
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and as always, we do have the privilege of having back Gary Lachman, this time to discuss his latest book, Lost Knowledge of the Imagination. How you doing today, Gary?
Oh, I'm doing well, Miguel. Thank you very much for having me on the show again.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. It's almost, the year isn't complete unless you're here to bring your gnosis, and we're glad to do that, and I'm very happy you imagined this book because I really enjoyed it.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And what better place to talk about it than here on Aeon Byte?
Exactly. A little gnosis for everyone. So,
so little gnosis goes a far way.
And especially in these days. So, yes, we do need more imagination. We'll certainly get into this. I guess we can start. What made you write this book, Gary? You've been on sort of a roll with these spiritual biographies like Blavatsky and Colin Wilson and all that. In this book, you decided to sort of cover a concept.
Well, it came from writing a previous book called The Secret Teachers of the Western World, which was more of overall kind of history of the West, seen sort of through the lens of esotericism. And as I was doing that book, this phrase, the lost knowledge of the imagination, kept coming back to me. And it comes from the poet, Blake scholar, and essayist Kathleen Raine, who for many, many years here in London, she was sort of the guiding spirit behind the Temenos Academy, which is sort of an alternative learning academy. And Temenos means sacred space, or the kind of the space in front of the temple of the gods in Greek. And what Kathleen Raine meant when she was talking about the lost knowledge or the learning of the imagination, and she also talks about the rejected knowledge or the forgotten knowledge, is that there's a whole tradition of understanding the imagination in a way that's very, very different from how we tend to understand it. We tend to think of imagination as either some form of substitute for reality or a fantasy, as in the sense that that's just your imagination. Or we see it as somehow, on the cutting edge. It has this utilitarian character of, being at the forefront of things and figuring out the next big thing and all that kind of stuff. Or, and we tend to, give it a place in general in the arts and so on and so on. But what she means by it is something very, very different. And this came to her from her great love of the Romantic poets, Blake and Shelley and Coleridge. And what she found by reading them, and studying them, and also writing poetry herself, and her own experience with her own imagination, was that what they're talking about in their poetry is this completely other way of understanding imagination. And fundamentally, it's something that's at the center, the very heart of our being. And when she talks about knowledge, it means it actually has a cognitive character to it. Again, not in the sense that imagination, not in the sense of being a substitute or some kind of dream world that, you imagine because the real world is, too inhospitable. It's an imagination that actually gives you more of reality. It's a way in which we can understand reality in a deeper way, and having to do with our interior world and realms of reality that extend beyond the physical and the sensory. And she found that these poets, the sort of images they used and the symbols and the metaphors, they all related back to this tradition that reaches back to Plato, and after him, the Neoplatonic philosophers of Plotinus in the Alexandria, the same time as the Gnostics, and the same time and place. In fact, Plotinus, you probably know, had a few choice words about the Gnostics. Yeah. So she related this whole, and it was the idea that the imagination had its own sort of terrain. It had its own kind of geography. In a way, it was a place. And it's a place that we have a yearning for. We have a kind of nostalgia for some place, we've never been, but it's actually somewhere we are all the time. It's this interior sort of place. And she, much later in life, she went to Cambridge in the 1920s. And it was during that time that this came to her very, very vividly, because she had grown up reading these Romantic poets. And then when she got to Cambridge, she discovered that all of that was just, passé. And it was very much out of date and considered sentimental and nostalgic. And the sort of poetry that was being read and the sort of poetry that was being written and literature being written was much more sort of the everyday, the mundane, the banal, all based on a materialist sort of view. I mean, one of the sort of signature poems at that time is T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which, and rightly so, again, it shows the world in this kind of light of kind of grim banality and everydayness. And it wasn't until rather late in her life, when she was in her 60s, that she wrote a collection of her essays called Defending Ancient Springs. And there's a wonderful essay in there called The Use of the Beautiful, this is where she sort of speaks very eloquently and very movingly about this whole tradition. And it's not tradition in the sort of traditionalist sense of René Guénon or Julius Evola. It's this tradition of the imagination that she found in Plato and Plotinus and Blake and these poets and all that. So what I'm doing in the book is taking that theme of the imagination as something that's not just fantasy or make-believe or sort of anything goes, but that it has an actual kind of geography, let's say, or a topography, or the imagination is actually about another reality or this reality, but even more, and exploring that through a few different figures.
I think a key element to understand this is you write about the philosopher Owen Barfield and his work on language, and it's very fascinating. Sometimes it's hard to get your head around it, but he talks about ancient men and how they thought, and he basically says that speech and nature came into being along with one another. That's a hard one to understand, but that is true. We used to think differently, poetically, metaphorically, didn't we?
Well, this is precisely why this knowledge of the imagination is lost or forgotten or rejected. A variety of different terms to indicate that we no longer have it. And what Barfield, who is he's probably best known as being a great friend of C.S. Lewis and one of the Inklings, this group of writers who met at this pub in Oxford, including Lewis and Tolkien and Charles Williams and Barfield and so on, is that he started out, again, in the 1920s, and he was fascinated with language. And he became fascinated with how language through poetry, how it has this effect on us, how words, when they're put together in this kind of way, somehow have this transfiguring effect. If you're sensitive to it, it alters your consciousness to a great degree, he would say. And what he came to understand was that if you look at the history of language, it seems to indicate that at the very earliest times, or various the earliest records we have of language, which obviously have to be sort of written, because people spoke. It was oral for a long time before any kind of alphabet and any kind of written language was invented. Was that when you go back into the earliest times, the language seems very, very metaphoric and poetic and figurative and what we would call imaginative. And when Barfield was writing in the 1920s, the sort of historians of language then, linguists, the way they saw things, they saw it through this Darwinian kind of lens. And because that was that sort of developmental sort of narrative was the most prominent, and it still pretty much is, with us today. And so the only way they could assume things to have happened was that, the earliest times, human beings lived in a world just like the world we live in today. Obviously, not with all the man-made things in it, but the sky was the way it was, clouds were the way it was, mountains were the way they are. We see the natural world today in exactly the same way that people in the ancient world saw the natural world, and their language must have, this Darwinian perspective compelled them to think in this way. Their language must have started with very simple grunts and groans, sort of kind of things pointing. So ugh meant that. And if you said ugh and pointed to that enough times, that would be somehow become a word. And this is what Barfield calls sort of the ugh, ugh, bow, wow, sort of theory of language. And the thing is, though, there's no record of any kind of language like that. The kind of, there's no sort of primal, it's a very literal way of understanding language. Because the idea was for them is that we can't account for this metaphoric language that we have on record. Because what we must assume, given the Darwinian model, it must have started out very simple. And then at some point, there was like a whole generation of sort of, prehistoric poets or whatever who kind of invented all these metaphors and stuff like that. And then it just settled back into being everyday literal language. And we've just inherited this. And any case, Barfield says, well, if you take off your Darwinian sort of spectacles, language tells us a different story. What if it's the case that the earliest language is very figurative and metaphoric and poetic because that's the way people of that time saw the world? They saw the world in this way. The world was much more living for them. Nature was more fluid. It was more animate. And we all talk about, notion of animism, being with ancient peoples and indigenous peoples and so on and so on. And we smart moderns or postmoderns tend to think, well, they're just making a big mistake. They're just being superstitious. But what Barfield suggested is like, well, perhaps the way they perceived the world, it was like that. And perhaps it was actually like that. They weren't just mistaken to perceive it that way. The kind of sharp division between our interior world and the world outside that we have today. We all tend to think like, well, my interior world is a little sort of puddle of consciousness inside my head. And that's it. It doesn't get beyond, my skull. And then there's a world outside. And what Barfield says, well, it doesn't, language in ancient times, the earliest language suggests that situation wasn't quite like that, whereas it was much more fluid interaction between what we call our inner world and the outer world. And he even says there wasn't really that kind of differentiation. There wasn't that sort of sharp differentiation between one and the other. And so at the earliest stages of language, there was something that he called participation. We are, human beings and the natural world somehow, participated with each other. They weren't sharply divided. There was a kind of flow between the both of them. And this was the same sort of experience that he had when he was reading his romantic poets, the way they would describe, Blake talks about, seeing a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower. And, or the other poets, they have these sort of ecstatic experiences, looking into nature and experiencing it in this rather different way than we usually do, as being this just kind of stuff out there that's just out there, whether we, see it or not. And so he theorized and he speculated that, well, perhaps that was the case. So what's happened? So we're not like that. We see the world in a very different way. Well, if that's the case, then consciousness evolves. And so he felt, or he argued, that he could trace this evolution through the development of language, and how what seems to happen is language becomes more and more literal. The literalness of our language today isn't kind of like the beginning of language, the way it just starts naturally and then gets metaphoric. He's saying, no, it's the other way around. Actually, the literalness that we experience today is the end product of a long historical process. And there's another literary critic who I mentioned, a fellow named Eric Heller, and he talked about the shift from the age of poetry to the age of prose. And, you can find, many other thinkers saying similar things. The philosopher Hegel and Nietzsche, many of them, they talk about this earlier time when, this Homeric man, the Greek of the early sort of periods of, the time of the great myths and all that. He lived in a very much more poetic world than, and the metaphors that for us are just kind of figures of speech, kind of cliches, were vivid sort of realities for them. And so this led Barfield to the idea of like, okay, well, our consciousness evolved to this sort of more literal kind of prosaic sort of way. And does it stop there? And then he thought, no, actually, it can extend even further. It can evolve even further into something that he called final participation, which is when you regain that original kind of participatory relationship with the outer world, but you maintain your consciousness, you maintain your rational, independent ego. Because one of the drawbacks of the original participation is that we're immersed in the world then. We don't have an independent sort of, rational I that's separate from things around us. In order to gain that, we had to break away. But in Barfield's vision, it's that break isn't a complete stop. It's the beginning of this further movement. And again, so I talk about him just to get the idea to emphasize the idea that this sort of knowledge of the imagination, this way of experiencing the world through the imagination, its actual a kind of cognitive, experience, was something. It's not just fantasy. It's something that in a way was part of our heritage at an earlier time. Hence it's become lost. And the beginning of the loss of it goes back to what I referred to the German philosopher Karl Jaspers, what he calls the Axial Age. And this was this time around 500 BC, give or take a century or two, when all the fundamental ideas about morality and ethics and the good life and spirituality that still, more or less inform out the civilizations around the world. They all seem to appear around the same time. You have Confucius and I think Lao Tzu around the same time. You've got the Jewish patriarchs in the Holy Land. You have Buddha appearing in India. In Persia, you have Zoroaster. And the same event was taking place in Greece, but what happened there was not so much the kind of awakening of this kind of moral, ethical, spiritual consciousness. It was the awakening of this kind of rational consciousness that, has come to be considered the dominant Western type. And that was precisely that kind of beginning of this independent, questioning, critical, analytical, ego that, feels that sharp separateness from the world around it. And what's indicative of that is that the philosophers around this time, like Thales and Anaximander and so on, people that we call the pre-Socratics, they wanted to know what was the world made of. They didn't want a mythical narrative telling them how the world came into being, which all the mythologies could provide. They pointed at a rock and they said, what's the stuff? What's the basic stuff that everything is kind of made out of? So that's the beginning of this kind of rational inquiry, this kind of analytical, and that reaches its apex, we can say, at the early 17th century with the rise of what we call science. And it's very much then that the whole notion that imagination has a cognitive character to it that can tell us something about reality gets chucked out the door into the dustbin, because that's when sort of the whole hermetic sciences and all of that loses any of the prestige and credibility it had. So Barfield's in there to say, well, yes, we used to have a kind of consciousness like this, but we lost it, and then we really kind of rejected it completely around this time in the 17th century. And then the other people I talk about give examples of, the way we can still experience it today and so on.
Yes, and for the audience, I know people might be saying, well, there's Gary and Miguel being old hippies and talking all mystical and wispy and all that stuff, but this stuff is more than just speculation. It is, as they say here in the United States, it's actionable. And of the many examples you give, you have a great chapter on Goethe and how he was able to tap into the power of imagination. And the one example is he was, I forget where, and he was looking at the Strasbourg Cathedral, and wasn't he able to recreate how it was just using his imagination?
It's sort of like that. He was, he was Strasbourg, which I guess Strasbourg is on sort of the border between Germany and France at different times in its history. It was in one, country or the other. But there's a fantastic cathedral there. And what happened was Goethe was there, and it was still under construction while it was going on, and while he was there. And he spent a long time sort of just observing it, looking at it from different angles and different places, and still inside and out and all around. And at some point, he got into a conversation with some people, and they were talking about it. And Goethe made the remark that, sort of paraphrasing, I'm not describing it verbatim, but something along the lines of, yes, I could see where at one point there was some change in the design. It was originally supposed to do something, and then something else happened. And the people were surprised that he was able to do that, because, this wasn't public knowledge or anything. There wasn't any blueprint or something like that. And he said, how could you possibly know that was, going on? And he said, well, I put myself into the sort of the mood of the architect. I put myself into the mood of the building, as it were. And I observed it from, many different angles, and also with this kind of openness. You said, we're going to get accused of being hippies, but it's almost like love. He talked about what he called active seeing, and he brought this to bear on his studies in plant life, plant forms. So Goethe, he's one of the great poets and writers in Germany, the Faust and Sorrows of Young Werther, but he was also a scientist. And he did he did solid work in anatomy. He always gets a paragraph or two in sort of studies of, pre-Darwinian evolution. He took on Newton. He said Newton had it all wrong about light. And so he scandalized, the intellectual world by writing a big book saying how Newton got it all wrong. But the area of his scientific work that carried on more was his study in botany and what he called plant morphology. He practically started this whole discipline now. Morphology is the study of forms. And so he became fascinated once again, this transformation, growth, development, evolution. This was all something that was absolutely fascinated Goethe, and it was like the center of his whole vision of the world. And you might recall that in his early years, or in his early manhood, he was he studied alchemy. He even he put together a little chemical laboratory in his home and all that, and so on and so on. So this whole idea of transformation was central to his way of seeing. And what he would do is he would observe a plant going through all its kind of stages of development, from seed to sapling, all the way up and everything. And he would see how one part transforms into the next, and so on and so on. And what he was trying to find by doing this was what he called the Urpflanze, which in German means the primal plant. And you could think of it as a kind of blueprint out of which all of the plants are formed, or a kind of archetype, something that contains everything that all plants somehow emerge into is kind of contained within. It's kind of like a platonic form. And I mean, we can hair split about these things, but just to get the basic idea. And again, but for Goethe, it wasn't just an idea, because he believed it was something he actually could see. And he tells the story when he was in Italy, and he was in Palermo in Sicily, and he was in the botanical gardens there. And he found himself looking at the plants there, and somehow seeing them out in more or less a kind of natural setting rather than in his, study at home. This somehow triggered something, more vivid, or, whatever. Something happened then. And he said that he saw it. He actually saw what he called this primal plant. And it's not a plant you could take. He couldn't take it out of the botanical garden, steal it, and take it home and, plant it in his own garden. Nor was it just an idea. It was something that had an imaginative reality. He grasped it with his imagination, but it actually had a reality. It was an objective, how do you want to call it, a phenomena. It was a real phenomena. And he really felt that he had discovered this. And this was another way to practice science. And again, I go back to saying that Kathleen Raine herself, she wrote poetry, wrote about Blake and that tradition, but she also, studied, like Goethe, she studied when she was in university, she studied plant botany and things of that sort. So he was, really excited about this. And there's a famous story about Goethe and the other great German poet of the time, Schiller, meeting at a scientific convention. And they were both commiserating about the way science was practiced, this analytical method that cut everything up into bits and pieces and atomized everything. And both of them wanted to be able to study nature the other way around, sort of from the whole out, this, the totality emerging into all, into its most simplicity, rather than, taking something that's whole and chopping it up into bits and pieces to see how it ticked, as it were. And during their conversation, Goethe said to Schiller, "Yes, I must tell you about this discovery I've made about, the primal plant." And Schiller was very, polite and listened to Goethe. At the end, he said, "Well, look, thank you for telling me. It's just an idea, It's not, it's not something I can grab or touch or smell or something like that." And Goethe he was a bit teed off about that, but he was a master of tact. And he said, "Well, if that's the case, then I happen to be able to see ideas." And so this is a way in which Goethe developed this kind of what he called active seeing. And it's a kind of imaginative encounter with what you are observing. And it's a different way. It has the same kind of meticulous and, disciplined observation of phenomena that regular science, or the science we're used to, engages in. But with him, it had something that was more of himself. He was aware that, the observer and the observer in this kind of exchange. And this is something that we know, many years later, from Heisenberg. But he was aware then that, somehow you have to take into account the state of the observer, when he or she is engaged in the observation. And Goethe knew there was a certain kind of rapport that he could get into with the plant, when he was observing it, just like he got into a rapport with the Strasbourg Cathedral. And it would tell him things. It would tell him something. I mean, this isn't that far off. It's, different setting and a whole different kind of context than, say, when, Jeremy Narby or other people talk about on their ayahuasca experience, when they have, the plants talk to them and tell them things. And even, Paracelsus, the great Renaissance alchemist and doctor, he talked about, being able to see into the inner, reality of the plants in the forest, and they would be able to tell him things as well. So there's a whole tradition of that. Jakob Boehmer's famous, experience of seeing the sunlight on a dish, and it's the bright flash sort of sent him into this sudden mystical state. And he talks about seeing the signature of things, seeing into the heart of nature and all that. And again, that's part of this lost knowledge of the imagination. We seem to have this faculty from being able to get into the inside of things. And this is that kind of consciousness that Barfield was talking about, this participatory kind of consciousness from the ages past. We still have it in us. We basically pushed it aside because we've learned how to do this other kind of knowledge. And that's very useful. We don't want to jettison that. But it needs to be complemented by this other. And look at the people that are interested in this. They aren't these kind of rejects of society. It's Goethe. He's like the greatest German, writer of his age, and these are all people whose genius that we recognize. And they're telling us things that, if someone on a street corner told us, or some new ager somewhere, or a couple guys like us having a conversation on the internet, say, that's just wacky stuff. But they're saying, in essence, the same sort of thing.
Yes, and it's not far off. And it's, as you said, it's not something that's sort of supernatural. I mean, it reminds me of like Giordano Bruno saying, everything's connected in the way that the center of everything is in everything. Or you write in your book, The Quest for the Historical Hermes Trismegistos, the hermetic idea that we are in the universe, but the universe is housed in our head. And this is, again, you're talking about this connected view to the universe. And it shouldn't be that, it sounds radical to us, but it's not. For example, I look at the work of Rupert Sheldrake and how dogs have you might say, a telepathy with their owners. They know when the owner's coming, no matter what time. And we don't think it's strange as if an animal can detect a storm hundreds of miles away, or if a dog can detect an earthquake hours away, because they are, you might say, connected to the universe, but we have lost that, our instinct, our power to draw into the collective unconscious and connect it with the world around us.
No, I mean, that's it. And many have felt the effects of that loss. I mean, you can say all sort of myths of the fall in some ways, sort of narratives of some kind of fall or some kind of expulsion from paradise, or any number of myths that posit, yes, there was a golden age, there was the better time in the past, and something happened, and, hence things are the way they are now. But at the same time, we all experience moments of this other kind of consciousness, this other way of knowing. I mean, that's the simplest way I try to put it in the book. This other way in which we can understand the world, or just engage with, And I think all of us experience moments of this, different times, and depends whether you pay attention to them. The other thing is, sadly, we do tend to live in a culture that either dismisses them completely as pathological, or just, simple-mindedness, or, whatever. Or we kind of find neat places to put them in, so we can allow them, say, in literature, let's say, or yes, that's something happens when you take a drug. It's not, the drug is making that happen. It's not that reality is really like that, but you're just feeling it's like that because of the effects of the substance you've taken and all that. But there's evolutionary reasons why we're in this situation, because it was absolutely necessary for us to step out of that earlier embedded kind of relationship to the world, much like the way animals have. I mean, animals, as you say, they're able to know things in ways that we can't understand, but at the same time, they can't tell us how they know it. I can know something and I can tell you. I can't know in the same way the animals. I can't know just, or I might be able to, if I paid attention to it. But right here and now, I don't have that kind of intimate connection, say, with the weather, so I know, whatever it's going to change or not. But I can read up about possibilities of, whether, change and all that sort of thing. And not only can I do that, I can tell you about it. So the animal has that kind of more direct, immediate knowledge, but it can't communicate it, in any kind of clear way. And so to be able to develop language, to be able to develop knowledge, to be able to develop conscious, rational knowledge, and all those things go together. You need a language. This is the thing you said earlier, that Barfield said. I mean, there's a kind of triad. There's the world, the self, and language all could emerge at the same time, because it strikes me, and it struck him, you can't really have one without the other. And in order to have, you have to have the separation, and the separation is recognized because you can more or less say, that's the world and this is me. I'm not that. I am this. I'm not that. And so you need some method of recognizing the distinction between the two, and the language is the one to do it. So in some way, in order to gain, the benefits of rational thought and language and ideas and knowledge and, the mastery of the planet that we have now, we had to lose that kind of, embeddedness. And I mean, one of the ways I sort of say it in the book is like, to be able to understand the laws of planetary motion, we had to kick the angels off the planets. We had to sort of denude them and just say they're just kind of balls rolling around in space. And okay, and then from there, yeah, we can do it. But again, there's a loss. There's a lot. You lose something, you gain something, but you lose something. As you say, we've lost that connection to things. We've lost the sense of any kind of relationship to the world around us, other than one of use, a utilitarian, and that obviously is we're have recognized for some time now, the problems that have arisen from an abuse of that kind of relationship, and the way that we've just basically everything's just at hand for us to use, and we've ravaged the planet in many ways, and so on from that. So there are absolutely invaluable benefits gained from the split, but there are problems generated by that too, and that's how evolution goes on, though. So the next step of the evolution would be we have to overcome these problems that the previous step of our conscious evolution have produced. And one way to try and repair, I mean, I did a whole book called The Caretakers of the Cosmos, which was about somehow the notion that human beings' mission or purpose in existence is to repair various faults and wreckages that are here in the world. And one way of doing that is for us to regain this connectedness, this kind of Rene Schwaller de Lubitsch, the sort of maverick Egyptologist and alchemist. He talks about the intelligence of the heart. This was a kind of way of knowing things that the ancient Egyptians had. And again, it's an intelligence, but it's of the heart. So it's not just the cerebral, what he called cerebral thinking, which breaks everything up into bits and pieces. I mean, everybody talks about these things in almost exactly the same way. And one of the most important books about this to me in recent years was E. McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, about his rebooting the whole right and left brain sort of discussion. And to put it simply, the right brain presents this kind of holistic, total, global kind of picture of things in which we find ourselves in it, living in it. But it's a very fuzzy, vague, imprecise, fluid perception of things. And in order to unpack that, the left brain is able to break it down into bits and pieces. And both are needed in a kind of, tennis match in order to, this wonderful volley to keep things going. But what seems to have happened in recent times is that the left, the analytical, the one that breaks everything down, has gained a kind of dominance. And what he's talking about in, terms of, or neurohistory is very much mirrored or paralleled or given a kind of narrative in the whole kind of the intellectual history of the West. And I would also say this whole idea of this rejection of the lost knowledge, because the lost knowledge is a kind of body of right brain knowledge, I would say. It's a body of, it's a tradition based on a kind of right brain way of perceiving the world.
Yes, indeed. And I love in one section you mention that has turned us into a 21st century schizoid, man. So I love how you brought up King Crimson into your book. And that's indeed you could say the Cartesian paradigm has split our brains, and all we see is the real world and the pretend world. We no longer see these two worlds, the world of imagination, the spectral world, as Derrida called it, and the material world. We're stuck in the material world as 21st century schizoid mans.
Well, I mean, that was a very provident song. I mean, when was that? 1969. Yeah. So, that was, I don't know, what are we, 40 years on? 50 years ago, I guess, almost. So, yes. Well, I mean, McGilchrist sort of says that in his book. He says the kind of left brain dominant environment that, we in the West the secular West have been creating around ourselves for the last, whatever, 100 years or so. It's also increasingly, well, it's leading to an increase of mental health problems like schizophrenia. I mean, there is a kind of split. We do seem to be living in a world in we're told conflicting things all the time. Even something as simple as, say, like, any kind of number of, say, science documentaries about the cosmos, the wonderful mysteries of the cosmos and all that. And, you show lots of photos and talk about black holes and, galaxies and the great walls and things of that sort. And then whoever's doing it is usually kind of, gushing and kind of gasping for air at how, fantastic and, mysterious and miraculous and all that kind of thing is. But at the same time, the scientific pictures, it's absolutely meaningless. It's just a, big collection of kind of, gases and other, chemicals just out there for no reason whatsoever. So, I mean, yes, it's big. And in that sense, it's awesome, but there isn't any sort of thing miraculous about it. So it's just, you're supposed to gaze with wonder at these things. At the same time, you're told on the official level that it's just, that's meaningless. The whole universe is meaningless. Your life is meaningless. And so there's conflicting messages. And then, it's difficult to navigate in a world where, pretty much the whole way in which you can absorb any meaning out of your experience is sort of relegated to a minor, position. And, there really isn't any place for the kind of, well, one of the reasons why this knowledge is lost is because the conditions under which it flourishes are hard. It's difficult to find them these days. It requires quiet. It requires free time, basically leisure. It requires a certain amount of meditation, reflection, contemplation of objects, and we live in a world that's increasingly noisy, fast moving, functional, utilitarian, not designed really to give you a lot of space, to relax and explore your own inner experience. And so, yes, and this is one of the things McGilchrist says in Master and His Emissary, is that this is the danger, that increasingly, if we more and more create a world that doesn't allow for this other way of knowing to ever come into our lives, then we will be schizophrenic. We'll be completely cut off. We'll be completely cut off from our own inner being. And that I would say is essentially what all the spiritual disciplines are about. Fundamentally, they're about somehow connecting with your inner being, connecting with your interiority. To some degree, making yourself whole. Bringing the two sides together in some way. And no, I would think that's absolutely our job, so that we're not 21st century schizoid. We could be 21st century integral man, I guess. Women are integral people. Maybe there's a new song, that like old Sly and the Family Stone song, every integral people or something like that. I'd be for that.
Yeah, that would be a great reboot. But we've been talking about us and nature, and you mentioned the inner worlds, but in another fascinating chapter, which you talk about Carl Jung, you talk about we must journey to our inner world, but what might be startling to some is that our inner world is really as independent as we never thought before. It is its own entity.
Yes, that is a very strange experience. You mentioned Jung, and this is something that Jung discovered after his breakup with Freud. And he went through a long period of, sort of psychic disturbance and depression and confusion. And, many people say he basically had a psychotic episode. But he famously recounted all this in his Red Book, which, was kept from publication for many, many years. It was only about, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or so, maybe not even, that it was back in print. It was in print. And it's, if you don't know the Red Book, it's this fantastic tome of illuminated writing and paintings by Jung, and these narratives of these strange inner experiences he had. And what Jung did, he felt for the longest time that he was going mad. And at one point, to free himself of this oppressive sense, he said, "Okay, well, I'm just going to let go, and we'll see what happens." And instead of trying to fight off all these fantasies, he allowed them to happen. And he had this remarkable inner experience, where he found himself in this interior world, inside his own head, metaphorically. And, we occupy that, each of us do that already, and then in our dreams as well. But what he found is that he encountered these entities or these beings or these people that live there. And famously, he encountered this kind of archetypal old wise man character that he named Philemon. And Philemon would talk to him. He became his inner guru. And Philemon said, one of your problems is that you think everything inside your head belongs to you, but it doesn't. He said, when you go out into the forest, the plants and the trees and the birds and the animals, they don't belong to you. They're in the forest just as you are. You share the space with them. Well, it's just like that inside your head. And Jung coined a phrase, the objective psyche, which I always was disappointed that he didn't use as much. And the other one, the collective conscious, the collective unconscious, became more popular. Because to me, it sort of says, it describes his experience, to me at least, a bit more accurately than the collective unconscious does. But it's the idea that there are things inside your head that have nothing to do with you. You, once you get into that past your own personal sort of, subconscious, when you go into these deeper inner realms, you're entering a space that others occupy. And there are other inhabitants, and you're just one among them. And this was something that, just completely bowled Jung over. But this is how he developed his whole, psychology of the collective unconscious and the archetypes and so on. He even says in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections that everything came out of that. Everything that came after, was born from this experience. And this is something that other people who go on these interior journeys discover as well. One of the ones I write about in the book after telling Jung's story is the French philosopher and Iranologist and student of Persian mysticism, Henri Corbin. Corbin is famous for coining this phrase, the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world. And he coined the term imaginal to contrast it with imaginary. And this is sort of a contrast with what I was saying earlier about sort of this knowledge as imagination as something to do with knowledge, and not just your imagination, just imaginary, just make-believe. Because again, like Jung, he experienced himself, and also through the study of this 10th century Persian mystic named Suhrawardi, who was again, he's another one who straddled both sides. He was an Aristotelian, philosopher, which is very logic and empirical based, and then at the same time he was a Sufi and practiced and devoted himself to other spiritual teachings and disciplines as well. But Suhrawardi, like Jung, went on these inner journeys, and he encountered inhabitants of these other worlds. And Henri Corbin wrote about his narratives, these kind of stories that Suhrawardi wrote, because he didn't talk about these interior journeys, let's say, sort of objectively, or kind of like it was more of a narrative. It was like a poem or a tale, and there's a whole sort of narrative character to these interior journeys where you go deep inside and you meet someone, and then they take you on another journey, and the whole idea is to get to Mount Kaf, and Mount Kaf is this kind of spiritual center. And one of the amazing things that takes place when you've successfully journeyed to Mount Kaf and you've reached the end of the quest is that this complete turnaround takes place about your understanding of the relationship between the inner and the outer. Whereas now we all believe, okay, there's just a little puddle of consciousness, inside my skull, and out there is the real world. Well, when you get to Mount Kaf, when you've gone on the spiritual Gnostic journey, you're transformed, and the world is transformed when what actually happens, everything that was outside is actually inside. And in many ways, the whole distinction between outside and inside is no longer holds up. And similarly, this is the sort of participatory, state that Barfield was talking about. But you maintain your, independent consciousness, and you're aware of things. You're not embedded completely and just completely part of it. If you think of the difference between being in a dream and then a lucid dream, because when you're in a dream, you're in the dream, you're sort of part of it. but you don't have the rational consciousness. You don't have the detached consciousness to recognize that you're in a dream. You just take it for granted. If the wall melts and you walk through it, you don't kind of, hey, that's weird. You don't really say that. You just sort of carry on. But what happens in a lucid dream is that we're aware we're dreaming, and then we can reflect on the experience while we're having it. And this is similarly, you can say, to what Suhrawardy and Corbin are writing about. And one of the interesting things that Corbin says is that the best time to try to go on these journeys is in what's known as the hypnagogic state, which is this liminal in-between condition, that's in between sleeping and waking. We all experience it at least twice a day, when we're falling asleep and then when we're waking out of sleep. I mean, some of the researchers, again, they split hairs between, hypnagogic, which they say is falling asleep. Hypnopompic is when you're rising up out of sleep into wakefulness. But I think to all intents and purposes, they're pretty much the same. And the one difference I would say in actual practice is that I found it easier if you have the time in the morning to lie in bed a bit longer and try to catch yourself rising out of sleep, and you can maintain that state. Whereas if you try to do it at night as you're falling asleep, oftentimes you could just have a bad night's sleep. So that's, at least that was my experience. And I think most of the people that have written about it sort of did do that. Swedenborg, Manuel Swedenborg, the great Swedish savant, another character who's both a scientist and I guess we can say a mystic, for the sake of a better word. And he wrote reams and reams and reams of scientific studies about the brain, about anatomy, about the cosmos, the universe, and so on and so on. And then he started to go on in his 50s. He started going on these interior journeys, much like Jung, much like Suhrawardy. In his case, he went to heaven and hell. And he met angels, and they walked him around heaven. They walked him around hell. They talked to him about different things. He went to different planets and so on and so on. But Swedenborg was able to somehow linger in these hypnagogic in-between states for extended periods, apparently for hours on end. So he mastered a kind of meditative state. But again, he too, the whole idea is like, we think this is real in front of me, and what's inside my head is just subjective. It's not real. It's at best a poor copy of reality, when in actuality it's the other way around. It really is the other way around. And one of the fundamental sort of ideas to come out of this studying this lost knowledge is, or ways of looking at the situation, is that one of the foundations of what we call the modern world was laid by the philosopher John Locke in the 1600s, following Descartes. And he said that basically we're all, it had political connotations as well, because he said we're all born tabula rasa, which means blank slate. When we are born, the psyche, the mind, there's nothing on it. It's absolutely clean slate. It's an empty screen. It's a white sheet of paper, and it's only through experience of the outside world coming to us through the senses that anything gets in there. So he said there's nothing in the mind that wasn't first in the senses. Everything that's in the mind gets to us through the senses. And in my talks, I usually say it's rather like if you have a flat, an apartment, it's empty, you have to go out to IKEA and buy a bunch of stuff, and you bring it home, and then you have it there. But when you first have it, it's absolutely empty. But what people like Jung and Blake and Goethe and Corbin and others say is that no, it's the other way around. It's that we wouldn't be able to perceive an outer world if it wasn't for the archetypes or the forms or these kind of interior, imaginal kind of blueprints. And rather than the mind being a reflection of nature, which is what Locke says, they say no, nature is a reflection of the mind. And again, this is what you're saying about the Hermetic teaching. Everything, lies within consciousness. It's within us, and we project it out into the world out there. And so again, that's a complete turnaround. And that's something that Suhrawardy, or the person who followed kind of the Gnostic quest of these stories, these narratives, at the end of the story, that would be sort of the experience. And so William Blake says it in one of his poems, the world around you, though you perceive it is without, it is actually within. And this is one of the sort of, again, it sounds wacky, but what we really are interested in, does sound wacky because, we live within the constraints of a, particular paradigm of way of looking at things. But basically what we want to do is be able to sort of take that apart a bit and be able to say, is there a different way for us to understand, the relationship between inner and outer, and do we get an idea of what that other way may be from all these people we've been studying in the book and others as well.
Yeah, as you quote Colin Wilson, who said imagination is not to escape reality, but to create it. So even he knew of the power of imagination.
Oh yeah, I mean, in the beginning of the book, I sort of name check Colin, and I say this is for me, it's a handy kind of one sentence definition of the imagination, or way to look at it is that imagination is the ability to grasp realities that are not immediately present. So it's not a escape from reality. And it's not a kind of substitute for it, but it's a deeper engagement with it, and it increases our grasp of reality. I mean, if we decide that reality is only what's present to our senses, then we have to somehow account for how do we know that someplace we're not looking at right now is real. I mean that's a rather banal example. That's the kind of thing you get in Philosophy 101. I mean, and I'm not now right now looking at my bedroom, but I still. I assume it's real. I don't assume, if I can turn around fast enough, I'll see that it's not there because I'm not looking at it. And also, one of the central themes, again, that comes out of it, as you say, is like imagination has this kind of creative character, power to it. It's not only cognitive, but it's actually creative. And I think we can understand this in a couple different ways. I mean, one way, which is very popular these days, and which I've, funnily enough, the next book I wrote after Lost Knowledge sort of picked up on this, the whole idea of, create your own reality. Imagination can create reality and things of that sort. And this is this book, Dark Star Rising, which is about sort of all the occult and new thought and positive thinking surrounding Trump and other forms of sort of politics happening today. But, it's just in a simple sense, if you know more about something, you can bring that knowledge to your experience of things, and that the thing that brings it all together and makes it a whole is your imagination. You can, if you think about, you can read up a lot about a city and all the facts and everything and its history and all that, but that's, no matter how much you do that, your actual, that is very different than actually going to the city and your experience of it, But at the same time, if you just go to the place and you don't, you haven't done any homework about it, let's say, you're there and you don't know anything about it. And yes, you'll have your experience of it, but it's only limited by what you can bring to it. But if you actually study a lot about a place and then actually go to it, you have both the best of both worlds then. And so you have the immediate sensory experience. You're there in the place, but you can bring to it everything that you know about it. So you're adding to the experience, you're adding another dimension to it. And you're making your experience more real by that. But in a more direct sense, it's the idea that somehow, and this is one of the occult, the basis of occultism or magic in any form, is that the imagination itself can somehow have a direct effect on what we call reality, the outer world. And that's the basis of all sort of positive thinking and new thought and a variety of different, occult practices. And I mean, one of the things I tie in with all this is the phenomenon of synchronicities. Jung's ideas for his name for meaningful coincidence. And fundamentally, what is a synchronicity? It's when something that's in your mind and something out in the outer world, happen at the same time and they have a meaningful connection. And there's no causal connection. You can't say that one caused the other, but somehow they're connected in this meaningful way, and a really, really meaningful way. It has an effect on you. It's more than just a coincidence. And we tend to think, oh well, it's just a coincidence. But you and I know, and other people that are interested in these things know, that we can't explain away synchronistic phenomena with just this notion of it being coincidental. In some way, in those moments, there is an interpenetration between the inner and the outer world. So there does seem to be times, at least, when this happens in some way. We can't explain it. I don't know how to. I'm not convinced by any of the arguments that try to bring in quantum physics and all that. I'm not saying they shouldn't do that, but if someone tells me quarks are responsible for it, it just doesn't quite cut it for me. But still, the phenomena itself is undeniable. I mean, I've experienced enough of them to just say that I'm as convinced of their reality as I am anything else. But they do seem to say that our usual ideas of the separation between inner and outer don't hold up all the time. Well, the next step to that is, well, can you somehow make them happen? And that, I would say, is the basis of all magic and new thought and positive thinking, somehow inducing synchronicities, inducing this kind of, interpenetrative experience between inner and outer worlds, to take place. And, some people say it can happen. But then even on a, I would say, a broader, more fundamental level, all the great poets, Blake and Coleridge and Goethe, and philosophers like Plato and others, and the Hermetic tradition, they all say it all begins with imagination. Imagination is the fundamental primary agent for existence, in some way. That sounds completely mad to us, because we think of imagination as some kind of false existence. But what Blake and Coleridge and Plato and we know the whole Eastern tradition of the mind takes precedent over matter and all that. That's saying something completely different. So, I think the thing is for us to try to get our head around it, as you say, in a way that we can articulate it, so that it makes sense. We can all go and have these experiences and try to different ways to induce them, and we can get personal benefit out of that. But I think if we want to somehow alter the perception of things around us, in the world that we're in, and somehow stop or mitigate this proliferation of this kind of, left brain, non-imaginative way of perceiving the world, we need to somehow understand the process and be able to articulate it. I'm trying to do that in my books. I'm doing the best I can, folks.
No, I think you've done a great job. And to end, Gary, I'm assuming we were talking about how to gain that lost knowledge of the imagination. And, of course, you talk about active imagination, meditation. There's so much in your book. And for the audience, I'm assuming you have to find what works for you and make it work. There is no manual for this. But you talk about poetry. And I think we've lost the idea of what a poet is. For example, you and I can listen to Bob Dylan and we can take the music out, and this stuff really transforms us. We know Bob Dylan is going to the imaginal world, if you would. But what to you what is really a poet instead of somebody who can make something rhyme?
Yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting question. And that's actually a question that a lot of poets and philosophers that are interested in poetry and poetic thinking, they've asked themselves, what is the place of poetry today? And I said earlier that Barfield and others, they talk about the shift from the age of poetry to the age of prose. In poetry itself, I have to say, I don't read a great deal of it myself anymore, except for the ones that I've always loved, like Blake or Rilke or Yeats or, some others. So contemporary, I'm not that well versed in, but what I do sort of pick up on the periphery seems to have, morphed into more performance kind of thing, and, a kind of, branch of rap and stuff of that sort, which has its own place, but it's not the same thing. And it seems to be more concerned with sort of social issues. And so, again, you can write poetry about anything, but the poetry that Kathleen Rain was talking about is sort of communicating the teachings of this lost knowledge of the imagination. It's a particular kind. It's of these sort of romantic poets. These are the poets of the imagination. If you have Blake, everything is the imagination in Blake. It's the eternal realm where the true nature of things relies, and not the perishable forms that we see in the natural world and all that. And for Kathleen Rain and for people that are attuned to it, when you read this kind of poetry, you can have a strange experience when you suddenly remember. You feel like you're remembering something. You feel like you're remembering. One of the wonderful poems that does this for me, and I think it does for many people who get into the mood, is Kubla Khan, by the Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was, one of the great romantic poets, and he's probably most known today in the alternative world as, somebody who took a lot of opium, and he drank it in the form of laudanum. But he has this wonderful poem called Kubla Khan, and it's, in Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure-domed decree. And he says it's a fragment because I just said, he drank laudanum, and he talks about how he took his little tincture of it and he got into this reverie. And he started seeing these visions of caves of ice and a sunny pleasure dome, and he started writing the poem down. It's these lovely cadences and rhymes and these kind of archetypal images. And then, sadly, the story is that there was a knock at the door, and he was interfered with. And when he went back to write the poem, he couldn't remember any more of it. It had come to him in this kind of, again, this reverie, this sort of hypnagogic state. But if you really can get into the mood, and again, you have to allow yourself the time, and you have to allow yourself, the contemplative space to be able to slow down and feel the rhythms, and that it will, I think, if you're in the right, mindset, it'll evoke this kind of sense of nostalgia and a memory. But it's for some place you've never been. And that place you've never been, because it's been kept from us for a variety of reasons, is that interior world. It reminds us that it really exists. It reminds us that it's there. It reminds us of this other part of ourselves that, for sake of a better word, we can call the soul. I mean, Plotinus said, when we see something and feel that it's beautiful, we do because it reminds us of our soul. And somehow the beauty, the feeling of the beauty itself, the recognition of the beauty itself, is the soul in some way. We're reminded that we're reminded that we have this thing, that we are this. So much, in this learning of imagination is about memory. Plato said all knowledge is memory. There's a way in which we're brought back to an understanding, a sense of ourselves that we somehow, lost touch with. So, I would suggest, as you say, you're right. There isn't a royal road to it. I'm not advocating any one particular discipline. I think all of these things are about this. What I would say is a way I think it's helpful to get a kind of idea of why we're pursuing them. Where our consciousness is now, and why all of these different kinds of spiritual pursuits and other pursuits and consciousness and all that. Why we fundamentally are doing them. We're doing them because of this, this shift that happened a few centuries ago and sort of broke off this other part of ourselves. But I think any attention we pay to our inner world will be helpful. And if you have the chance, when the weather gets better, go get a book of, poems from the library, maybe, give the library some attention. Go find a little sunny patch somewhere and sit down and, read some of these old romantic poems and just try to get into the mood of it. And it may evoke this sense of some lost paradise, because it's there and it's within us. And Kathleen Rain and all the different people I talk about in the book say we still can have, access to it. We have to do a bit of work, but it's there waiting for us.
Yes, it reminds me of the German term Sehnsucht that you wrote about in past books, that longing for something that we miss, but we can't put our finger on it.
Yeah, Sehnsucht, inexpressible longing. This feeling that, when you see the over the horizon, the sunshine, the sunset over the horizon, or some kind of the misty mountaintop. It's, that's one of the strange things. If you run, you're never going to get the sunset. You're never going to get to the horizon. And if you go to the mountain, when you get there, it's a lot of rock and stone, and it's cold and cold. So there's somehow it's symbolic. These things are symbolic of something, and what they're symbolic of, I would say, is they remind us of this interior world. They remind us of this inner space. And that's that is one of the things. There's a kind of Yeats talks about this in one of his poems, where he talks about this waterfall that when he was a boy, it would evoke this ecstasy in him. But he said, what could I do? I couldn't go and hug it, and if I went and touched it, I just would touch cold stone and water. So it's not the actual sensory water and stone and that he wants. It's symbolic of something. It somehow triggers a memory of something, and it's a memory of the soul in some way. And again, we've talked about the soul a lot, but I don't know what inner world. I would say, soul, inner word, imagination, real you. All those things are interchangeable, and they're all about the same thing.
Well said. And for the audience, please get Lost Knowledge of the Imagination. We've only scratched the surface. There's so much to it. I enjoyed it. I read it in like 2 sittings because, again, it's packed full of gnosis, as I'd like to say, but it's also not a volume. It's a very good book. But I think that's all the time we have today, Gary. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on AM Bite Gnostic Radio, and we look forward to talking to you soon when your book Dark Star Rising comes out.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Miguel, and I look forward to being on too.
This is the AM Bite interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of having back Eric G. Wilson to discuss his new book, Keep It Fake, Inventing an Authentic Life. How are you doing today, Eric?
I'm doing fine, Miguel. Thanks for having me on your show again.
Always great to have you on back, Eric. Why don't we start with why you wrote the book? You obviously have written books that seem to go against the grain of common perception or the common wisdom, like Against Happiness and even Everyone Loves a Train Wreck. Why did you decide to write this book? And I guess it all starts with a ball, right? The word ball.
That's right. That's right. I opened the book with the sentence, I was the boy who said ball. I was about 6 years old, and I was sitting at the dining room table. And earlier that day, I had a talk with one of my friends about his first word, and I wondered what my first word was. So I asked my mom and dad, and they both in unison said, "Your first word was ball." Well, I've since done some research, and I find that that's a fairly rare first word. And I wonder if my dad in particular turned some baby babble into that word, because that word would have been very pleasing to him. He was a football coach, had played football, hoped that I would be a football player, and he fit me into a sort of narrative he'd laid out for me from the very beginning. And that the idea that he could inscribe me into his story by saying that was my first word was very important to him. So that's just one of many memories that inspired me to write this book, which is really about how when we are born and as we grow up, when we become aware of ourselves as individuals, by that time we're already inhabiting all these narratives that have been written for us. Our parents' narratives, our community's narratives, all sorts of other narratives. So one of the great goals in life, as I suggest, is trying to forge your own narrative. And that's really what it means to be a self, to be an authentic self, is to imagine your own story, take responsibility for that story, and being willing to endlessly revise that story as you need to as the circumstances of your life change.
And when exactly did you realize this? In your book, you obviously talk about certain points in your life, college and playing football and becoming a teacher. When did it sort of, or is this something that sort of comes out here and there and all of a sudden, before you know it, you're in the narrative of the demiurge and you sort of forget?
Well, I'll say that I guess the main impetus behind my writing of this book is that it's a different way for me to address my lifelong struggle with depression. I've been in and out of psychotherapy. And what I realized about 2-3 years ago was that one reason that I wasn't really progressing in my psychotherapy was because I still had this notion that there is an essential self, some sort of innate Eric Wilsonness that I got from birth, and that my great goal in life would be to strip away all of the artifice, all the phoniness, and find that one self. Well, I wasn't finding that self. And in fact, what I concluded was that I'm rather wishy-washy, and I'm changing a lot, and I'm paradoxical, and I'm contradictory. And the quest to find the one consistent self was becoming increasingly frustrating. So luckily I found a psychotherapist who freed me from this myth of the essential self. He said, look, your identity is a construct. He said, think about it. If I ask you, who are you? You probably think about several memories from your past. You think, oh, well, I'm the person that did this at the age of 5, and that led to this event at the age of 7, which led to this event at the age of 15, so on and so forth. In other words, when we start thinking about who we are, we almost unconsciously construct a narrative, a story. Now, of course, that's a highly selective story. How many things have happened to you? Billions. And of those billions of things, how many of those do you actually remember? Well, hundreds of thousands, millions maybe. But when it comes down to you constructing your past, constructing your narrative, you focus on only a handful of those events. So there's a real sense in which our past is something we try to create into a cogent narrative that helps us make sense of who we are right now in the present and helps us imagine the future that we want. In other words, it's as if our identity is a novel of which we're the protagonist, a novel that we're constantly revising as our present moment changes.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Even as we discussed before the interview, you wondered, well, would this book work for Aeon Byte? And even when I got the book, I was reading, I said, well, there's no William Blake. Oh, wait, he mentions the Matrix. I can go with this. But the truth, and we discussed it in our interview about William Blake, is the Neoplatonist notion of imagination. The Neoplatonists said, well, if we look at the stories of the gods and heroes and we start pretending we're them and get the best, we can become gods and heroes. And of course the Gnostics, they saw this character of Jesus and Mary Magdalene and Judas and said, hey, we're just going to change the narrative and write our own little gospel and we'll start acting like this. So in a way, your book is very Gnostic, isn't it?
Well, that's what I realized as I was writing it, that even though on the surface it suggests that the world of time and space is fake, and that we ourselves are fake. What I realize is precisely what you suggest. That okay, let's imagine that everything is fictional, meaning that there's a gap between word and world. Any description we make of the world, scientific, theological, may suggest some truth, but there's no one narrative that can make sense of the world once and for all. So if that's our starting point, that our idea of knowledge is a construct, well, what do you do with that? Well, it can lead to despair. We're alienated from the real. But also it can be exhilarating and liberating, because now we have an opportunity to construct our own narrative. Now that's very hard work, as you suggest. So there are many, let's say, demiurgic narratives out there. Narratives that attempt to limit our choices, narratives that attempt to tell us we're not free, narratives that suggest we're caught in some sort of causal chain and our whole life is mapped out for us. If I'm a fundamentalist Christian, for instance, I pretty much have a sense that I've gotten it figured out and I have certain rules by which I live, and that's my story. I've become a rather flat character in a rather flat novel. So the Gnostic move, as you suggest, is to imagine fresh narratives that are more flexible and pliable and open and capable of connecting with as many rich experiences as possible. And I do think that the impulse of the first Gnostics to rewrite the book of Genesis or to rewrite the Gospels in such a way that the Judeo-Christian God was called into question or mocked or denigrated is precisely what I'm getting at, that life is art. If you want to have a rich life, create a good piece of art by which you live. In other words, try to live poetically.
Yeah, I certainly couldn't have said it better. And a little segue, this reminds me of when I first got out of rehab and I started going to AA meetings. And they still have this aphorism where they go, fake it until you make it. Have you ever heard of that?
I have.
And my first instance, that's when I started questioning myself and my narrative, I would be like, wait a second, I've been a liar and a cheat all my life. I've never been authentic. And you're asking me to now be inauthentic, to pretend I'm a good person, a good father and whatever. But this is really what it's part of it, right, Eric? I mean, you had to go out of therapy and start pretending you're a good father and husband.
Well, that's right. After years of being in sort of Jungian, Freudian psychoanalysis, I ultimately concluded that kind of therapy wasn't working for me. And what would work for me is cognitive behaviorism, whose basic precept is, if you want to be happy, don't change your interiors, but just smile more. And the physical action of smiling will eventually generate the happiness you desire. In other words, change your external habits to change the internal. Fake it until you make it. So a perfect example of this, my first 3-4 years of parenthood, that was my time of darkest depression. I was suicidal. I'd gotten diagnosed with bipolar disorder for the first time. It was an awful time, and I was alienated from my wife, and I was having a difficult time connecting with my daughter. And my therapist said, "Look, man, you're just living in a bad novel. You need to change your book, brother. You need to change your novel." And he gave me some exercises. And one of them was rename recast your relationship with your daughter in such a way that you can feel more comfortable around her. So what I realize is that, I'm a really terrible traditional father. I have no clear moral compass. I'm not really capable of giving her good lessons to live by, but I can make her laugh. I can be silly. I can be stupid. I can be goofy. That was always my thing. So I created a character called Crazy Dad. And my main goal in life was to make my daughter laugh. And it worked. I mean, as we started just being ridiculous together, it allowed us to kind of deepen our relationship, and it evolved certainly into more serious sorts of activities. But it was a perfect moment of how simply putting on a mask, not a mask that's totally different from my impulses, but putting on a mask that kind of focuses my impulses in one way rather than another, was really life-altering for me and made me a much better parent than I would have been had I stuck with the more traditional narrative of what a parent should be.
And how has the reception been, Eric, or how have others reacted to, especially because, as you write in your book, we do live in a culture where it's all about, like, Aladdin, the Disney Aladdin, be yourself. We got to be authentic. Gurus are saying that. And our great archetype, again, as you mentioned, is George Washington, and I cannot tell a lie. How have people reacted?
Well, I think a lot of people find these ideas to be troubling. I think that many of us, especially in America, are brought up to believe in a true self, to seek a true self, that the goal in life is to kind of find an identity and be consistent with that identity, to toe the line, to stay the course. And suddenly someone comes along and says, you know what, that's just something made up. What you call yourself is not real, it's not stable. So I would say that.
And there you have it, our interview with Gary Lachman on his latest book, The Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, as well as a teaser for our interview with Eric G. Wilson, based on his latest best-selling book, Keep It Fake, Inventing an Authentic Life. I hope this is all getting you closer to realizing your potential as a true inventor of better realities and purveyor of impossible secrets. These are FUBAR times when Jehovah is really ramping up the crazy and oppressive. So we all need to shine like crazy diamonds to kindle lights of meaning in this darkness of mechanistic being. You will not be a star or reach for the stars, but steal the stars to make your own sons of potential. So please become a member to get this full second part, and so many other shows. At the end of the day, no one is getting rich here, but your support helps keep this Red Pill cafeteria open. You can go to the godabovegod.com and find out how to become a member or patron at Patreon, and all the other benefits. Only $5.99 a month to join, complete and not partial episodes, access to more than 380 shows with the best and brightest in Gnosticism, Western esoteric, and free thought. You'll get your own private RSS feed where you can listen to all complete shows on the podcatcher of your choice. And for patrons, we now have an exclusive one for you. You'll get an invitation to our Inner Sanctum of Gnosis Facebook group. Many past guests hang out there, like Robert Price, Tim Freak, Andrew Phillips Smith, Steve D., Robert Sullivan, Joanna Kuyawa, and more. What's more, I'm always there to directly and personally answer your questions and issues, and give you news on the shows and other happenings before they happen. Same benefits if you become a patron at Patreon, except you get early shows. If anything, a few shekels here and there really helps via PayPal or the US mail. So let's continue discovering the lost knowledge of the imagination and our authentic selves buried under so many aeons of evolution and incarnations. Glad you're here with me on this journey. Glad we can share our gnosis together. Goodbye and hello, as always.